Ethan Carter stepped out of the rusted old sedan he had borrowed for the week. The air smelled of oil and metal, thick with the hum of machinery. He adjusted the frayed cap on his head, ensuring it shadowed his face just enough. His usual tailored suits and polished shoes had been replaced with scuffed work boots, faded jeans, and a simple gray shirt. A disguise so unremarkable, he blended in like any other factory worker. The sprawling factory loomed before him, a monolith of industry built on his vision. Carter Industries had been his empire for over a decade, but standing here now, under the identity of Eli Matthews, he was just another cog in the machine. It had been years since he'd set foot in one of his own factories. Meetings, reports, and profit margins had kept him in boardrooms and away from the ground floor. Today, he intended to see it for himself. The security guard at the entrance barely glanced at him, waving him through after checking his fake temp ID. Inside, the factory was a controlled storm. Metal clanked against metal, conveyor belts hummed, and the rhythmic hiss of hydraulic presses filled the air. Workers moved like ghosts, silent and mechanical, their eyes downcast as they toiled under the harsh fluorescent lighting. A gruff voice barked from the far end of the room. "New guy. Over here." Ethan turned to see a middle-aged supervisor with a permanent scowl carved into his face. The name on his badge read Frank Patterson. His thick arms were crossed, and his gaze held no warmth. "You're late," Frank snapped. Ethan checked the cracked watch on his wrist. He was 5 minutes early. He held back the instinct to challenge him. This wasn't a boardroom debate. Instead, he nodded. "Won't happen again." Frank grunted and jerked his thumb toward the nearest assembly line. "Don't talk. Don't slack. Do your job." "Got it." Ethan nodded again and took his place at the line. The rhythmic grind of machinery, now his world. The work was mindless. Position a component, press a button, repeat. Within an hour, sweat gathered at his collar. Muscles he hadn't used in years aching. He stole glances at the others around him, their expressions vacant, exhaustion lining their faces. Beside him, a woman with sharp eyes and dark curls tucked under a bandana worked with practiced efficiency. She barely acknowledged him until their shift overlapped on a particularly jammed conveyor. "Don't stare too much," she murmured under her breath. "They'll think you're up to something." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "They?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she flicked a glance toward the elevated office overlooking the factory floor, where a man in a crisp suit observed the workers like a vulture. "That's Donovan," she said quietly. "Head of operations. The guy everyone fears." Ethan followed her gaze. The man had the look of someone who had long forgotten what it meant to work with his hands. His suit was pristine, his posture stiff with authority. Something in his demeanor unsettled Ethan. He filed it away for later. "I'm Lisa, by the way," the woman continued, her voice hushed but firm. "Been here 5 years. Long enough to know you don't ask too many questions." Ethan met her gaze. "What happens if you do?" She didn't answer, just pressed another component into place. The day dragged, fatigue gnawing at Ethan's limbs. Around the factory, he saw the little things. The flickering lights no one had bothered to fix, the way workers flinched when supervisors walked by, the desperate pace at which they worked. Every corner held an unspoken tension. Then he heard it, a low, pained voice, almost drowned out by the machinery. "Please? I need help." Ethan turned his head, scanning the floor. Just a few feet away, a worker clutched his forearm, his skin pale and glistening with sweat. Blood seeped through his sleeve, staining the fabric. His breathing was ragged, his legs unsteady. The man barely had the strength to raise his voice. Just 5 minutes." A supervisor, stocky with a cruel smirk, towered over him. "You take a break when I say you take a break," he sneered. "Get back to work." Ethan felt a cold anger settle in his chest. Every fiber of his being screamed to intervene, but he hesitated. He was here to observe, to understand, but was this where he drew the line? The injured worker wobbled, his knees nearly buckling. Ethan stepped forward, gripping his arm before he collapsed. The moment he touched him, the supervisor's head snapped toward him. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded. "Helping him," Ethan said, voice calm but firm. The supervisor's eyes narrowed. "You new here?" Ethan met his gaze without flinching. "Yeah." "Then here's your first lesson. You don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong." Ethan clenched his jaw. "He's bleeding?" The man scoffed. "It's a scratch. He's fine." The worker, still trembling, looked between Ethan and the supervisor, silent but pleading. Lisa's voice was a whisper behind him. "Walk away." Ethan swallowed the bitterness rising in his throat. He had never backed down from a fight in his life, but this wasn't about pride. This was about knowing when to strike. He let go of the worker's arm, watching helplessly as the man was shoved back to his station. The moment passed, but the weight of it stayed. Ethan turned back to his work, hands steady, mind anything, but something was deeply wrong in his factory, and he was going to find out exactly what. Ethan worked in silence, his mind replaying the moment over and over. The blood staining Miguel's sleeve, the way the supervisor had dismissed it without a second thought, the way Miguel had simply accepted it. No protest, no fight, just quiet, resigned obedience. It gnawed at him, a slow-burning fury kept in check only by the knowledge that his cover had to hold. If he revealed himself too soon, he'd never uncover the full truth. Miguel hadn't returned after lunch. His station remained empty, the smudged tools and unfinished parts left behind like an abandoned battlefield. No one spoke about it. No one even looked in that direction. The absence felt heavier than words, a silent warning that ran deeper than policy. Lisa worked beside him, her hands quick and efficient, but Ethan noticed the occasional flicker of hesitation in her movements. She knew something. He waited until the shift break before speaking. "What happened to Miguel?" he asked, voice low. She didn't look at him. Instead, she peeled off her gloves, rubbing at the deep creases in her palms. "Miguel's gone," she said flatly. "That's all you need to know." Ethan leaned against the metal work table. "People don't just disappear in the middle of a shift." Lisa let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Here, they do?" She glanced toward the upper office, where Donovan stood behind the glass, arms crossed, surveying the floor like a predator watching its herd. "You ask too many questions, Eli." Ethan met her gaze, steady and unyielding. "And what happens if I do?" Her eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Then one day, you won't show up for your shift either." The words settled between them, heavy and absolute. Ethan's fingers curled into a fist. He had built Carter Industries with a vision of fairness and opportunity, yet here he stood, surrounded by something that resembled neither. Someone had turned his factory into a machine that didn't just manufacture products, but also ground people down to nothing. When the shift ended, Ethan lingered near the break room, watching as exhausted workers shuffled out into the night. Their faces were worn, their shoulders hunched with the weight of silent burdens. He followed their path toward the exit, slipping into the crowd, his ears attuned to the murmurs between them. Said he complained too much. Third one this month. HR won't do anything. They never do. Ethan slowed his pace, listening, piecing fragments together. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't new. Miguel wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. As he reached the parking lot, a sharp voice cut through the air. "You there? New guy." Ethan turned. The stocky supervisor from earlier, Paul, stood near the loading dock, arms crossed over his chest. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Boss wants to see you," Paul said. Ethan kept his expression neutral. "Which boss?" Paul smirked. "You'll find out." He followed him through the factory's side entrance, down a dimly lit hallway lined with worn-out posters preaching safety regulations that no one seemed to follow. Paul stopped at a door marked Supervisor's Office and knocked once before shoving it open. Inside, Donovan sat behind a cluttered desk, papers stacked haphazardly around him. He didn't look up right away, instead signing off on a document before setting his pen down with deliberate precision. When he finally lifted his gaze, his smile was slow and cold. "Eli, isn't it?" Ethan nodded, stepping forward. Donovan gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit." He didn't. Donovan exhaled, as if disappointed, but not surprised. "Word is, you've been asking a lot of questions. That's not how things work here." Ethan held his ground. Miguel was hurt. He needed help. He needed to do his damn job, Donovan countered. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "Let me explain something to you, Eli. This factory runs on discipline, efficiency. We don't have time for complainers. If someone can't keep up, they don't belong here." Ethan felt the slow coil of anger in his chest. "And what happens to them?" Donovan tilted his head slightly. "They make room for someone who can." Ethan let the silence stretch, the unspoken truth hanging between them. Donovan wasn't just enforcing rules. He was eliminating obstacles. "I'm giving you a chance," Donovan continued, his voice deceptively casual. "Forget Miguel. Do your job. Keep your head down. Or you can walk out that door and not come back. Your choice." Ethan forced his expression into something neutral, something unreadable. Then, finally, he nodded. "I understand." Donovan studied him for a long moment, then leaned back, satisfied. "Good." Ethan turned and walked out of the office, Paul watching him with amusement as he passed. The moment he was alone in the hallway, he let out a slow breath. His pulse hammered against his ribs, but not with fear. With purpose. He had all the confirmation he needed. His factory was being run like a sweatshop, and Donovan had turned himself into the gatekeeper of silence. Ethan had seen enough, but they hadn't seen him yet. That would change soon. Ethan returned to the factory floor the next morning, his body going through the motions, but his mind burned with quiet rage. Every clang of metal, every hiss of machinery, every tired, sunken-eyed worker around him reinforced what he already knew. This place was a prison disguised as a workplace. The difference was he now held the key. Lisa worked beside him, silent but watchful. She had seen him walk into Donovan's office the night before, and more importantly, she had seen him walk out. That alone made her wary. "You're still here," she murmured, keeping her focus on the conveyor belt. Ethan nodded, pressing a bolt into place. "For now." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Did they threaten you?" Not in so many words. A shadow crossed her face, but she didn't push. Instead, she moved with sharp efficiency, her fingers flying across the machinery. But Ethan could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she never let herself relax. "Do you know what happened to Miguel?" he asked. Her hands stilled for half a second. "He's not coming back," she said finally. Ethan clenched his jaw. "Where do they take them?" Lisa swallowed hard. "I don't know. I just know they don't leave on their own." Before Ethan could press further, a commotion near the break area drew their attention. Raised voices. The sound of something crashing to the floor. Then a single, sharp cry. Ethan didn't hesitate. He shoved past the line of workers, breaking into a near run as he rounded the corner. Paul, the stocky supervisor, loomed over a worker who had crumpled to the ground. A thin man, barely in his 20s, clutched his ribs, his face twisted in pain. A toppled metal cart lay beside him, its contents spilled across the floor. "I told you to lift with your legs, idiot," Paul sneered, his boot nudging the man's side, not enough to be called a kick, but enough to humiliate. The worker gasped, struggling to push himself up, but his arms shook with the effort. Ethan saw red. Before he could think, before he could measure the consequences, he was already moving. Paul barely had time to register the danger before Ethan grabbed the front of his shirt and slammed him against the nearest work table. Tools rattled from the impact. "Touch him again," Ethan said, his voice dangerously quiet, "and I'll make sure you can't lift a damn thing ever again." A stunned silence fell over the room. Paul sputtered, caught between outrage and shock. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Ethan leaned in, his grip unrelenting. "Try me." A slow, cruel smile spread across Paul's face. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Ethan didn't let go. "No. I'm fixing one." A door slammed open in the distance. Heavy footsteps approached. "Donovan." Ethan released Paul just as the head of operations stepped onto the scene, his presence sucking the air out of the room. His sharp eyes swept over the workers, the fallen man, the scattered tools, taking in everything in an instant. "What's going on here?" Donovan's voice was calm, too calm, the kind that carried an unspoken threat. Paul straightened, brushing off his shirt like nothing had happened. "New guy thinks he can throw his weight around." Ethan didn't flinch. "I stopped him from assaulting a worker." Donovan let out a slow breath, as if Ethan was a petulant child testing his patience. "Eli," he said smoothly, "you don't seem to understand how things work here." "Oh, I understand just fine," Ethan shot back. "I understand that you're running this place like a sweatshop, that you're threatening workers, disposing of them when they're no longer useful, that men like Paul enforce your little regime through fear and abuse." A murmur rippled through the workers. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passed over Donovan's face. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. Then it was gone, replaced by a slow, cold smirk. "You think you know everything, don't you?" Donovan said, stepping closer. "But you don't know a damn thing." Ethan held his ground. "Then why don't you enlighten me?" Donovan studied him, then let out a small chuckle. "All right. You want the truth? Fine." He turned to the workers, raising his voice just enough to be heard. "This factory isn't just a job for you people. It's survival. You leave, and where do you go? You think anyone out there is waiting for you with open arms? You think some cushy office job is just around the corner? No. You work because you have to, and you stay in line because you must." He looked back at Ethan, tilting his head slightly. "You can pretend to be a hero all you want, but in the end, you'll fall in line just like the rest of them. Or you'll disappear, just like Miguel." Ethan felt something sharp and cold settle in his gut. Donovan knew. He didn't know who Ethan really was. Not yet. But he knew Ethan was dangerous to him. Ethan exhaled slowly, loosening his fists. He had pushed too far, too fast. Donovan wasn't going to tolerate his presence for much longer. And that meant he had to act. Because one way or another, this was coming to an end. The factory was quiet in the dead of night, save for the hum of machines left in idle mode and the distant beeping of security panels. Ethan moved with purpose, slipping between shadowed corridors, his pulse steady despite the risk. He had spent the past week memorizing security rotations, key entry points, and more importantly, the areas that were always off-limits. If Donovan was hiding something, if Miguel and the others had been taken somewhere, Ethan was going to find out. He reached the employee records room first, an outdated office with metal filing cabinets crammed against the walls. The company database should have shown every worker's employment status, but Donovan's team had made sure certain people simply vanished. No termination records, no injury reports, nothing. But Ethan wasn't looking for official documents. He wanted the scraps, the pieces of information someone had been too careless to erase. A locked drawer near the back caught his attention. He pulled a screwdriver from his pocket, jamming it into the mechanism until the latch gave way with a dull click. Inside, a pile of worn paper files sat haphazardly on top of one another. Miguel's name was on the third folder. Ethan flipped it open, scanning the details, work history, disciplinary actions. Then a single note scrawled in red ink. "Injury reported. Reassigned to Facility B. No further concerns." Facility B? Ethan frowned. Carter Industries only had one plant in this city. There was no Facility B. Unless Donovan had built something off the books. A noise outside made him freeze. Footsteps. slow, deliberate. Ethan shut the drawer, his heart pounding as he eased the office door open, just a crack. Paul stood at the end of the hall, his bulk casting long shadows under the flickering fluorescent light. Ethan ducked low and moved. He had learned how to disappear in plain sight a long time ago, how to control his breathing, how to step just right so his movements melted into the ambient noise. Paul walked past the office, without looking inside, muttering something under his breath. Ethan slipped in the opposite direction, following the narrow back corridor toward the loading docks. If Miguel had been relocated, then that meant there was a transport system in place. The only way to move people discreetly was through shipments, and that meant trucks. He reached the bay doors, just in time to see one backing into place. A group of workers moved toward it, loading crates with practiced efficiency. But one thing stood out immediately. None of them looked like standard employees. These men were different. Hired muscle. And then Ethan saw Donovan. The man stood near the truck, clipboard in hand, speaking to a tall figure in a dark coat. Ethan couldn't hear the words, but the exchange was brief. The tall man nodded once before stepping onto the truck. The doors shut behind him with a loud clang. Ethan's hands curled into fists. This wasn't just mistreatment. This was something deeper, darker. Workers weren't quitting. They weren't getting fired. They were being sold. And Ethan Carter had seen enough. He backed away, slipping into the shadows before anyone could spot him. He had enough evidence now, enough to blow this operation wide open. But there was still one thing left to do. He had to make sure Donovan knew exactly who he had been toying with. The next morning, the factory floor buzzed with tension. Workers whispered in hushed voices, throwing wary glances toward the main office. They all felt it, something was off. Then, at exactly 9 a.m., the main intercom crackled to life. Attention all employees. This is Ethan Carter. A ripple of confusion spread through the factory. Lisa's eyes widened. Inside his office, Donovan shot to his feet. I founded Carter Industries on the belief that hard work should be rewarded, not exploited. That every worker should be treated with respect, not as disposable assets. Ethan's voice was steady, unwavering. And yet, I have uncovered something disgusting. A hidden operation that treats human lives as transactions. Gasps echoed through the factory. Donovan, Ethan continued, voice cold. You've spent years thinking you own this place. Thinking you could run it however you saw fit. That ends today. The office doors burst open. Security teams, followed by police officers, flooded into the room. Donovan barely had time to curse before he was shoved against the desk, cuffs snapping around his wrists. Paul tried to run. He made it 2 steps before Ethan was there, grabbing him by the collar and throwing him into the arms of waiting officers. The entire factory had come to a standstill. Workers, tired, beaten down workers, watched in stunned silence as their oppressors were dragged away. Lisa met Ethan's gaze, disbelief written across her face. You, she started. I own this place, Ethan said simply. A heavy silence hung between them. Then, slowly, something unfamiliar spread through the room. Hope. It had taken too long. He had let it rot under his nose. But Ethan Carter was here now. And things were going to change.